The call came on a Tuesday, just as I was meticulously cataloging a collection of 18th-century botanical illustrations. My life until that moment had been a series of neat, predictable rows, each item precisely where it belonged. The voice on the other end, a crisp, formal drone belonging to a solicitor I'd never met, shattered the quiet order of my afternoon. "Mr. Thomas Blackwood?" he'd asked, a slight pause after the surname as if testing its weight, guarding my grandmother, Eleanor Blackwood. Grandmother. The word felt like a relic itself, something dusty and unused. I hadn't seen her since I was a boy, a vague memory of sharp eyes and a scent like dried lavender and old paper. Our estrangement had been a silence, not a conflict, a slow drift into separate orbits. He was a ghost even when alive, a name whispered occasionally by my parents, always followed by a sigh. She passed peacefully in her sleep last week. The solicitor continued, his tone utterly devoid of genuine sympathy. Her last will and testament names I as the sole heir to her estate, including Blackwood Manor. My initial reaction wasn't grief, but a profound, almost clinical annoyance. Blackwood Manor. I knew it only as a sprawling, decaying Victorian monstrosity in some forgotten corner of the countryside, a place my parents had always discouraged discussion of. An inheritance wasn't a windfall, it was a burden, a complicated mess that threatened to unravel the carefully constructed tapestry of my existence. I envisioned mountains of paperwork, property taxes, structural engineers. My only thought, pragmatic and immediate, was to divest myself of it as swiftly and efficiently as possible. 2 weeks later, my sedan, usually reserved for commutes to the archives, ate up the miles of increasingly narrow, winding roads. The landscape grew desolate, shedding its manicured fields for wild, untamed stretches of gorse and skeletal trees. The sky, a bruised purple-gray, pressed down low, mirroring the weight settling in my chest. Even the air seemed to thicken, tasting of damp earth and something indefinable, like old metal rusting in the rain. I passed a landmark I hadn't expected, a closed amusement park. Its skeletal Ferris wheel, rusted and motionless, clawed at the sky, a grotesque monument to forgotten joy. Peeling paint on what looked like a carousel roof, its vibrant colors faded to pastels of sorrow, stood silent behind a chain-link fence. It was a fitting herald, I thought, for what lay ahead. Blackwood Manor emerged from a thicket of overgrown pines like a predatory beast roused from slumber. Gables twisted into sharp, accusing angles, and the myriad windows, some boarded, others gazing out like empty eyes, seemed to watch my approach with an unnerving intensity. The driveway, once grand, was now a choked path of weeds and cracked flagstones. Dead ivy, thick as my arm, clung to the walls, its tendrils like skeletal fingers gripping the stone. I killed the engine, and the ensuing silence was absolute, heavy, almost viscous. No birdsong, no rustle of leaves, just the distant, mournful sigh of the wind. The massive oak front door, scarred and weathered, stood ajar, as if inviting me in or perhaps daring me. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak afternoon light that pierced the grimy stained glass panels flanking the door. Everything was draped in thick gray sheets, shrouding forgotten furniture in spectral forms. My archivist's mind, accustomed to order and cleanliness, recoiled. This wasn't just a house. It was a tomb, a repository of forgotten lives and untold stories. I felt a prickle of unease, a sensation I swiftly dismissed as the natural reaction to such a desolate place. It was old, yes, isolated, certainly, but nothing more. My plan was simple: get in, assess the contents, arrange for an estate sale, and then put the property on the market. It was a logistical challenge, nothing more. I was Thomas, the meticulous archivist. I dealt in facts, intangible records, in the irrefutable evidence of the past. There was no room for vague premonitions or unsettling atmospheric shifts in my world. I started in what appeared to be the main drawing room, pulling back one of the heavy sheets that covered a grand piano. A cloud of dust billowed, making me cough. The keys, yellowed and chipped, looked like a skeletal grin. The room smelled faintly of rosewater and something else, something sharp and acrid like burnt sugar. A tall, ornate grandfather clock stood in a corner, its pendulum still, its hands frozen at precisely 3 minutes past midnight. I spun around, expecting to see a loose pane, but there was nothing. But the feeling lingered, a subtle tightening in my chest, an irrational sense that I was not alone. The house wasn't just old, it felt aware, and it was watching me. The manor was less an inheritance and more a burden, a sprawling, decaying monument to my grandmother's reclusive final years. My initial inspection had confirmed my worst fears. Dust lay thick as frost on every surface, cobwebs draped like forgotten tapestries, and the air itself felt heavy with the scent of mildew and neglect. My goal was simple, clinical: Catalog, clear, sell. I was Thomas, the archivist, and this was just another collection to be meticulously processed, albeit one with a roof that occasionally wept and floorboards that groaned like ancient bones. I started in the study, a room dominated by towering, dark wood bookcases filled with leather-bound volumes I had no intention of ever opening. My grandmother had been a woman of obscure interests, or so I'd been told. I certainly hadn't known her. My parents had ensured that. I began systematically wiping down shelves, stacking loose papers, trying to impose order on the chaos. The air, thick with the smell of aged paper and something faintly metallic, scraped at my throat. I found myself running a hand along the spine of a particularly imposing tome, then along the dark, polished paneling of the bookcase itself. My fingers, accustomed to the smooth, uniform surfaces of library archives, snagged. I paused, tracing the anomaly. Just above a worn copy of some obscure treatise on folklore, a section of the paneling felt slightly off. I pressed lightly, then a little harder, my archivist's instinct for hidden compartments kicking in. There was a faint click, like a dry twig snapping in a silent forest. The section of the bookcase, perhaps 2 feet wide, didn't swing open with dramatic flair. Instead, it retracted with a slow, grinding sigh, revealing not a shallow recess but a narrow, pitch-black opening. My rational mind, ever the dominant force, immediately conjured images of damp rot, of mice nests, of whatever horrors decades of neglect might breed. I fumbled for my phone, its flashlight beam cutting a stark path into the gloom. The space beyond wasn't deep, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, but it was crammed. My breath hitched. This was no storage closet. The walls were uneven, rough-hewn stone, hastily plastered, and then covered in something else, intricate swirling patterns drawn directly onto the surfaces in what looked like dried pigment. Symbols I didn't recognize, angular and stark, repeated themselves in a dizzying array. They felt wrong, like a language designed to be seen but not understood, pricking at the edges of my comprehension. In the center of the room, on a rough-hewn wooden table, lay a collection of objects that defied any logical classification. My gaze snagged on a small, unsettling figurine, a grotesque, grinning clown, its painted eyes wide and fixed, its fabric clothes faded and torn. It was clearly a prize from a closed amusement park, perhaps one of the cheap, mass-produced horrors given away at ring toss or dart games. Beside it, other items, a polished black stone, impossibly smooth. Its facets seemed to shift and ripple under the flashlight beam. A cluster of dried, brittle roots woven into a knot that resembled a skeletal hand, and several tarnished silver medallions, each etched with the same unsettling, unfamiliar symbols from the walls. They were not art, not curios. They were tools or offerings. But what truly drew my eye, held it captive, were the journals. Stacked haphazardly, some bound in worn leather, others merely bundles of loose, yellowed pages tied with string, they filled a small, dusty crate. My grandmother's handwriting, a spidery scrawl I vaguely recognized from the few formal letters she'd sent to my parents, covered page after page. I picked up the top journal, the leather cover flaking beneath my fingers. But as I flipped through the pages, the entries grew more frantic, the handwriting more agitated, the sentences fragmenting. They speak of something ancient, something that sleeps beneath the earth. I read the words blurring slightly as my rational mind tried to reject them. It asks for understanding, for pathway. Then a later entry scrawled almost illegibly, "The others are wrong. The closed amusement park is merely a veil. The true gateway is here in the stillness. It demands attention." My grandmother, the recluse, the enigma, wasn't just eccentric. He had been searching for what? And what had she found? The air in the hidden room seemed to thicken, the sweetness of decay now mingling with something else, something cloying and ancient, pressing in from the rough-hewn walls. The silence wasn't empty, it felt watchful. My breath hitched, a faint tremor running through my hands as I lowered the journal. The clown figurine, with its perpetual, painted grin, seemed to be watching me, too. And for the first time since I'd set foot in Blackwood Manor, I felt a distinct, undeniable prickle of fear. This wasn't just a house to be sold. It was a lockbox, and my grandmother had just given me the key. The unsettling discovery of my grandmother's journals had ripped the veil from her eccentricity, revealing something far more sinister. The air, thick with the scent of aged paper and something indefinable, seemed to cling to my clothes, my skin. I couldn't leave it alone. The house, once a burden, now pulsed with a strange, morbid magnetism, drawing me back to that hidden room, to those brittle pages. I spent the next several days hunched over the journals, the meticulous archivist in me battling a growing, visceral dread. My initial determination to simply understand her, to find a logical explanation for the strange implements and cryptic notes, began to fray. The script, once elegant, grew erratic, jagged, as if penned by a hand trembling with fever or fear. Dates stretched back decades, then generations, hinting at a lineage of peculiar obsessions. The earliest entries spoke of a presence, an ancient hunger rooted in the very foundations of the house. It wasn't a ghost, not in any traditional sense. My grandmother described it as a deep echo, a resonance that demanded appeasement. She detailed complex rituals, precise configurations of objects, specific incantations whispered under certain phases of the moon. Each ritual, she claimed, bought time, staved off the inevitable. In these early pages, her tone was one of grim duty, a weary acceptance of a family burden. But then the shift began. The entries grew more frantic, the ink pressed so hard it tore through the paper in places. Her descriptions of the presence evolved. She wrote of bizarre visions, impossible geometries shifting in the corners of her sight, fleeting glimpses of faces that weren't there, the pervasive scent of something sweet and cloying like overripe fruit left to rot. And then the sacrifices. I started to feel it too. At first it was subtle. A faint, distant melody like a child's music box playing underwater would drift through the silent house, only to vanish when I strained to listen. My skin would prickle as if a spider web had brushed my arm, but when I looked, there was nothing. My own mind, I told myself, exhaustion, stress. But the experiences grew more insistent. It was heavy like a hand, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The scent of overripe fruit, sickly sweet, filled my nostrils for a fleeting moment before dissipating. My resolve to maintain my composure, to find a rational explanation, began to crumble under the weight of my grandmother's dissent and my own burgeoning unease. One afternoon, a particularly cryptic entry caught my eye. It wasn't about a ritual, but a location. My archivist's mind, desperate for a tangible link, something outside these walls, recognized it. Closed amusement park. Perhaps I reasoned seeing a place she mentioned would ground me, remind me of the world beyond her madness. The drive was a blur of rain-slicked roads and gray skies. When I arrived, the closed amusement park loomed, a skeletal monument to forgotten laughter. Rusting rides clawed at the sky, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The entrance gate, a grand archway depicting a smiling jester, hung askew, one eye missing, lending it a grotesque, winking leer. I pushed through a gap in the fence, the overgrown weeds snagging at my trousers. The air here was different, not the cloying sweetness of the house, but a sharp, metallic tang mixed with damp earth and something else. A faint, almost imperceptible smell of cotton candy, clashing with the pervasive damp. The carousel, its once vibrant horses faded and chipped, stood frozen in a silent gallop, their glass eyes staring blankly. The Ferris wheel, a colossal skeleton, creaked softly in the wind, a mournful sigh. As I walked deeper into the park, the faint music from the house returned, not a clear melody, but a discordant jingle like a broken music box struggling to play. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, pressing in on me, making my scalp prickle. Then I saw it. Tucked away behind the dilapidated bumper cars, half hidden by thorny bushes, was a small, ornate iron gate. It was locked, but beside it, carved into a crumbling stone pillar, was a symbol. The same symbol I'd seen repeatedly in my grandmother's journals, an intricate knot of intertwined lines and loops. This wasn't just a place she visited. This was part of it. The closed amusement park wasn't an escape. It was another thread in the tangled, generational horror he had tried to contain. The faint jingle grew louder, twisting into a distorted, childlike giggle that seemed to echo from the empty rides, bouncing off the peeling paint and broken glass. I was no longer an observer. I was being pulled in. The house, once a burden, had become a cage of my own making, its secrets demanding to be unraveled. I couldn't tear myself away from my grandmother's journals, the brittle pages now almost an extension of my own trembling fingers. The scent of ancient paper mingled with something else, something metallic like old blood, or perhaps just the dust of forgotten things, clung to me, seeped into my clothes, my very skin. I felt it under my fingernails, a persistent grime that wouldn't wash away. Hours dissolved into a hazy continuum. My eyes burned, tracing the frantic script, each word a tiny, barbed hook pulling me deeper into her madness. The grand parlor, where I had spread out the journals, felt less like a room and more like a cavern, the shadows stretching and contracting with a life of their own. A distant groan echoed from upstairs, not the settling of old timbers, but something more deliberate like a heavy sigh. I flinched, my head snapping up, but the sound didn't repeat. Just the house, I told myself, just the wind. But then a book slid from a shelf in the built-in library, landing on the polished floorboards with a sharp thwack. It was a thick, leather-bound volume on ancient folklore, one I hadn't even touched. I stared at it, then at the empty space it had left, a perfect rectangle on the dusty wood. My breath hitched. I hadn't heard a breeze. The windows were sealed. A cold draft, smelling faintly of damp earth and something acrid, swept through the room, raising goosebumps on my arms. The ornate chandelier above me, with its 100 crystal tiers, began to sway, not gently, but with a rhythmic, almost violent rocking. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just an old house settling. This was deliberate. I gripped the edge of the heavy oak table, gripped tight. The air grew heavy, pressing in on me, making it difficult to draw a full breath. I tried to rationalize it, faulty wiring, structural instability, but the explanations felt flimsy, crumbling under the weight of an escalating unease. Another door, somewhere on the second floor, slammed shut with a resounding boom that vibrated through the floorboards beneath my feet. It was too loud, too forceful to be accidental. My gaze drifted to a small, locked cabinet built into the wall beside the fireplace, one I hadn't managed to open yet. It had a peculiar, tarnished silver lock, intricate and almost organic in its design. A sudden, irrational urge compelled me to try it again. I fumbled with a skeleton key from the ring I'd found, the cold metal feeling like ice against my skin. The lock clicked, surprisingly easy, and the cabinet swung open with a soft groan. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed linens, was a framed portrait. It wasn't a photograph, but a drawing rendered in charcoal and ink. My grandmother, but not the woman I remembered, not the stern, elegant figure from my childhood. This was a nightmare made manifest. Her features were distorted, the lines of her jaw too sharp, her mouth a jagged tear, her hair a wild, tangled mess that seemed to writhe. It wasn't just a bad drawing. It was as if some inner horror had been externalized, superimposed onto her very being. This was her. This was what he had become, or what had become of her. My fingers trembled as I reached back for the journals, needing to anchor myself in something tangible, even if that tangible thing was her descent into madness. I flipped through the pages, searching for anything that might explain the portrait, the increasingly aggressive manifestations. My eyes scanned the frantic scrawl, jumping from date to date until a particular entry caught my attention. The ink was thicker here, pressed harder into the page, as if written in a feverish frenzy. It demands a place, a focal point, the old nursery where the cradle once rocked. It is not enough, it needs a true altar, a nexus, the cellar beneath the hearth. The stones remember, they resonate, a place of immense power. It feeds there, it grows, the ritual must be exact. The offering, a new keeper. The old nursery, the cellar beneath the hearth, a ritual site. I remembered the heavy, sealed door in the cellar, a door I hadn't been able to open, a door that felt wrong. The hearth in the parlor, a massive stone edifice that dominated the room. It was all connected. Suddenly, the grand double doors of the parlor, which I had closed securely behind me hours ago, slammed shut with such force that the very floor vibrated. A low, guttural growl, like a beast stirring from a deep slumber, resonated through the walls. It wasn't a sound I could attribute to settling timbers or old pipes. It was alive. It was angry. I stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of books, my eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. The windows were old, painted shut. The main entrance I knew was miles from any other habitation. I was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. The memory was jarring, out of place, a sign of my mind fraying. The air grew thick, like breathing through wet wool. Only the faint, dying light from the distant window offered any solace, painting the edges of the room in shades of bruised purple and gray. In that sudden, suffocating blackness, I felt it, a presence. It was here, and it knew I was here. It had woken, and it had trapped me. That sensation, the one I'd dismissed as a cliché, truly settled in my bones. A draining, profound emptiness where warmth should have been. The old nursery above, the cellar beneath the hearth, the heavy, sealed door I hadn't been able to open. It all clicked into place with a sickening precision. A ritual site. Not just a forgotten part of the house, but a place imbued with intent, with something ancient and demanding. My grandmother hadn't merely been a recluse, a victim of her own mind. He had been an orchestrator. I returned to the journals, my fingers trembling as I turned the brittle pages. The faint scent of dust and something metallic like old pennies seemed to cling to the ink. My eyes, once scanning for clues, now devoured every word, every scratchy drawing, every cryptic symbol. The early entries, once dismissed as ramblings, now shone with a terrifying clarity. She spoke of the hunger, the tether, the keeper. She wasn't researching a local legend. He was documenting her active participation in something monstrous. The entity. It wasn't just in the house, a passive malevolence. It was of the house, rooted, alive, and requiring sustenance. My grandmother wasn't fighting it, he was feeding it, or worse, preparing for its full awakening. Her meticulous notes detailed phases, cycles, specific astrological alignments that needed to coincide with certain offerings. Not blood, not explicitly, but energy, life force. The journals didn't spell it out in plain terms, but the implication was stark, a horrifying shadow stretching across the faded script. She described the transfer, the communion, and the generational pact that bound the manor to its resident horror. My stomach churned, a cold knot tightening with each word I absorbed. Deep within one of the larger, leather-bound volumes, nestled between pressed, desiccated flowers and a lock of what looked like child's hair, I found it, a hand-drawn family tree. Not a printed genealogy, but a sprawling, intricate web of names, dates, and meticulously rendered connections, all drawn in my grandmother's spidery hand. It started with the original builders of the manor, stretching back centuries. My own name, Thomas, was there, scrawled in faint pencil near the bottom, an ominous placeholder. My breath hitched. My eyes darted across the parchment, tracing lines, connecting dots. There were symbols beside certain names, a small inverted triangle, a circle bisected by a wavy line, single stark X. These weren't random, they marked a pattern. Every few generations, a name would have one of these symbols, always connected to this house. One particular entry caught my eye, a name from the late 1800s marked with the inverted triangle. Beside it, the note, the lure of the painted smile, last seen near the rusted carousel. Below that, a smaller, almost illegible scribble, the closed amusement park. The entity didn't just consume. It lured, it orchestrated. The horror solidified. This wasn't just a house haunted by a ghost. This was a carefully maintained prison, a feeding ground, and my family, my lineage, were its wardens or its livestock. My grandmother wasn't insane. He was performing a duty, one passed down through generations. She wasn't just a victim. He was a keeper. And the final, sickening realization bloomed in my chest like a poisonous flower. The pencil marked beside my own name, the dates coinciding with my arrival, my inheritance, the generational pact. I wasn't just the inheritor of a decaying manor. I was the next designated keeper, or perhaps the next sacrifice. The thought was a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. The house pressed in, its ancient timbers groaning, no longer just the sounds of an old building settling, but the hungry sigh of something vast and patient stirring from a long slumber. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else. Something cloying and sweet, like wilting lilies left too long in a closed room. My hands, still gripping the journal, began to sweat. My eyes darted around the study, once a sanctuary of quiet knowledge, now a chamber of horrors. I wasn't an accidental visitor. I was a designated participant. My grandmother hadn't just died mysteriously. He had completed her part, leaving me, her meticulous, unsuspecting grandson, to take up the mantle. The final, terrifying line in her last, half-finished entry stared up at me. The new blood comes, the cycle turns. And beneath it, a single, deliberate stroke, almost a flourish, ending the sentence. My grandmother had known, he had planned this for me. The realization had been a cold, heavy stone in my gut. Keeper, sacrifice. The words from my grandmother's journal clawed at my mind, echoing the groan of the house's ancient timbers, which now sounded less like settling wood and more like a predatory rumble. I was not just here to sell a property, I was trapped. But I wouldn't be a sacrifice, not without a fight. A grim determination solidified in me, a brittle shield against the creeping dread. I would find a way out, a way to banish whatever malevolence festered here. My fingers, trembling slightly, flipped through the remaining journals, then moved to the stacks of brittle, yellowed texts my grandmother had collected. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through the grimy windows of the hidden room. I read feverishly, my eyes scanning for any hint, any weakness, any ritual or counterspell that might sever the link. Some entries spoke of ancient pacts, of offerings made to appease a hunger. Others, scrawled in a frantic hand that I recognized as my grandmother's later years, hinted at a threshold, a veiled passage that could be opened or closed. But closed by what? And what was on the other side? One journal, bound in something that felt like dried, flaking hide, spoke of the blood of the next keeper as the only true release. My breath hitched. Release for whom? For the entity, or for the house, or for me? A low hum began, vibrating through the floorboards, a sound that seemed to originate deep within the earth beneath the manor. It wasn't a mechanical hum, but something alive, resonant. I clutched my cell phone, its screen a dim, comforting rectangle in my palm, and punched in the number for the local constable, the same officer who'd been so dismissive before. The line crackled, then a high-pitched shriek tore through the speaker, making me drop the device. It hit the wooden floor with a dull thud, and a thin wisp of smoke curled from its shattered screen. The hum intensified, a mocking crescendo. Panic flared, hot and sharp. I scrambled for the old, dust-laden shortwave radio my grandmother had kept in the study. Its dials were stiff, the antenna rusted. I fumbled with the power switch, twisting it until a faint static hissed. I tuned it frantically, searching for any human voice, any sign of the world beyond this cursed manor. Then through the white noise, a voice emerged, warped and distorted, but undeniably my father's. "Thomas, why didn't I listen?" My hands froze on the dial. The voice was heavy with a sorrow I remembered too well, a regret that had haunted my waking hours for years. It was him or an echo, a perfect mimicry. The static flared, then my mother's voice joined in, soft, pleading. "We told I, stay away from the cliffs, Thomas, stay away from the edge. The cliffs, the place where I had. The memory was a fresh wound festering. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. I had to get out. I ran, driven by a desperate, primal urge for escape. The front door was heavy, solid oak. I threw my weight against it, the ancient wood groaning in protest. It wouldn't budge. My shoulder ached from the impact. I tried the back door, the cellar door, every window, all sealed as if the house itself had clamped down, a predator closing its jaws. "No!" I yelled, my voice raw, cracking. My feet stumbled, then found a rhythm of their own, pulling me not towards escape, but deeper into its grasp. I was moving, faster now, a puppet on invisible strings, my mind screaming in protest while my legs propelled me forward. The familiar path to the main road was gone, replaced by a winding track overgrown with thorny brambles, leading into a dense thicket of gnarled, skeletal trees. The air grew heavy, thick with the cloying sweetness of stale popcorn and something metallic, like rust and old blood. A strange, discordant music, like a broken calliope, drifted on the wind. My stomach churned with a sickening lurch as I recognized the landscape unfolding before me. There, through a gap in the skeletal trees, stood the rusted, forlorn Ferris wheel, its empty carriages swaying gently in the unseen breeze. Beyond it, the faded stripes of a decaying big-top tent sagged, a canvas ghost. I was at the closed amusement park, a place abandoned decades ago, a local legend, a place I hadn't thought about in years. Why here? Why now? The calliope music swelled, a twisted melody of childhood joy turned into grotesque mockery. The air shimmered, and a carousel horse, its painted eyes chipped and vacant, seemed to turn its head, watching me. Then across the cracked concrete path, a figure emerged from the shadow of a collapsed roller coaster. It was a child, small and indistinct, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. "I always leave." My mother's voice, but distorted, laced with an icy accusation. My knees buckled. This was it. This was the end of me, the end of my sanity. The house hadn't just sabotaged my efforts, it had dragged me out, twisted my surroundings, and conjured my deepest fears into flesh and blood illusions. I was no longer fighting for escape. I was fighting to hold onto the last vestiges of my mind. The entity wasn't just in the house. It was in me, weaving itself into the fabric of my consciousness, pulling me apart thread by agonizing thread. I was a puppet, and the invisible strings were tightening, drawing me closer to whatever horrific spectacle awaited me in the heart of the closed amusement park. My mother's voice. My knees buckled. This was it. I was adrift. The accusation echoed, a cold whisper that seemed to vibrate in the very timbers of the house. My head spun, vision blurring. The ornate wallpaper in the hallway began to ripple, the faded floral patterns stretching and contracting as if breathing. The floorboards beneath my trembling hands softened, growing slick with a film I couldn't identify, smelling faintly of stagnant water and something metallic, like old blood on rusted iron. I pushed myself up, scrambling, desperate to escape the suffocating familiarity of the manor as it dissolved around me. Each step was a gamble. Doors I knew led to the drawing room now opened onto empty, echoing voids. Windows, previously showing the overgrown garden, reflected only a churning, bruised purple sky. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something sickly sweet like decaying cotton candy. The walls themselves seemed to peel away, revealing not plaster and lath but warped, weather-beaten wood planks. I stumbled forward, driven by a primal urge to find an edge, a boundary, anything solid. The manor was not just changing. It was unmaking itself, shedding its skin to reveal something far more monstrous. I pushed through a heavy velvet curtain that had materialized where a solid wall once stood, and the scent of sugar and rust intensified, hitting me with nauseating force. The world tilted. I wasn't in the manor anymore. Before me stretched a landscape of faded colors and broken dreams, a closed amusement park. Rust-eaten rides clawed at the bruised sky, their metal skeletons groaning softly in a phantom breeze. A Ferris wheel, half-collapsed, loomed like a petrified giant, its empty gondolas swaying with a mournful creak. Peeling paint on a carousel depicting leering, frozen animals flaked onto the cracked asphalt. The air was thick with the ghost of laughter, the phantom scent of stale popcorn and hot dogs, all overlaid with that cloying, sickly sweetness. This was the ritual site. My grandmother's journals had hinted at a place of lost joy, a crucible of yearning. This was it, manifested from the house's deepest, most corrupted corners. I felt a pull, an undeniable draw towards the very heart of the park. It was the call of the entity, a silent, resonant hum in my skull demanding my presence. My feet moved on their own, crunching over scattered debris, cracked mirrors, plastic prizes, shards of painted wood. The muted clatter of a distant calliope, its tune distorted and agonizingly slow, echoed through the abandoned grounds. My eyes were fixed on the center, where the largest ride, a towering structure of intertwined tracks, lay half-submerged in a shallow, murky pond. It wasn't just a roller coaster. It was a grotesque altar, adorned with what looked like tattered banners fluttering in the non-existent wind. The air around the tracks shimmered, coalescing into something vast and formless, yet undeniably there. It wasn't a creature of flesh and bone, but an absence, a distortion in reality itself. It pulsed, a silent thrum of immense power that resonated deep in my bones. Then the vision struck. My mind fractured, flooded with images too fast, too profound to process. I saw it not with my eyes, but with my innermost being. It wasn't evil in any human sense. It was merely other, an unfathomable geometry of consciousness that devoured light and sanity. I saw my grandmother, a tiny, insignificant speck, kneeling before it, offering something precious, something that shimmered with life and hope, only to be consumed without a ripple of acknowledgement. I saw generations before her, a lineage of custodians, of sacrifices, their faces dissolving into the swirling emptiness, their lives merely fuel. The entity had no face, no form, only an overwhelming presence that communicated pure, unadulterated indifference. It was a vacuum that pulled at the very fabric of my soul, threatening to unravel me into nothingness. My own existence felt insignificant, a fleeting spark against its ancient, hungry eternity. This wasn't a monster to be fought. It was a force of nature, an inevitable tide that had always been and always would be. It was a demand, an ancient, insatiable craving that echoed the accusations of my mother's warped voice. I was the next. I was the keeper. And my inheritance, my very self, was the next offering. The climax was here not a battle, but an unveiling, a horrifying revelation of my true purpose. My knees had buckled, a sudden, pathetic collapse that left me sprawled on the cold, grimy floorboards. The last echoes of that warped, icy voice, my mother's voice, seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of my bones. Then silence. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of an immense, suffocating weight. Every creak, every groan the old manor had accustomed me to vanished. The air itself felt thick, inert, as if all sound had been forcibly expelled from existence. I lay there, my face pressed against the dust-laden wood, unable to move. My breath hitched shallow and ragged, a pathetic whisper in the vast, new quiet. My eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at the splintered planks inches from my nose. They seemed to pulse with a faint internal light like veins beneath aged skin. The house hadn't just gone quiet. It had drawn a breath, held it, and now waited. Waited for me. A tremor began in my fingertips, spreading quickly through my limbs. My head throbbed, a dull, insistent ache that intensified with every beat of my heart, a heart that now felt alien, beating a rhythm that wasn't entirely my own. Slowly, agonizingly, I pushed myself up. My muscles screamed, but the pain was distant, muted as if happening to someone else. But it wasn't the same. The air shimmered subtly at the edges of my vision. A faint, cloying scent, like ancient dust mixed with something metallic and sickly sweet, clung to my tongue. I stumbled out of the room through the concealed door into the main corridor. The manor was no longer simply decaying. It felt alive in a way it never had before, not with a comforting, familiar presence, but with a predatory awareness. The very architecture of the house seemed to shift, subtly, imperceptibly, as I watched. The banister of the grand staircase, usually solid oak, appeared to twist, its carved newel post momentarily resembling a skeletal hand reaching out. I blinked. It was wood again, inert and inanimate, but I had seen it. I knew what I had seen. My feet dragged me towards the front door, a desperate, animalistic urge to escape pulling me forward. Each step was a monumental effort, like wading through thick mud. It turned with an unnatural ease, almost eager. Outside, the world was gray and indistinct. The fog, a constant companion of this remote place, was thicker than ever, swallowing the distant trees, blurring the lines of the overgrown garden. I pushed the door open, stepping out onto the porch, breathing in the damp, frigid air. It tasted of earth and decay, but also something else, something sharp and invigorating like ozone before a storm. I started walking, not knowing where, just away. The gravel crunched under my boots, a sound that felt deafening after the internal quiet of the manor. I followed the winding, overgrown drive, the fog swirling around me, a thick white shroud. Then through the mist, a shape began to coalesce. Not the road, not the woods, something impossible. A colossal, rusted Ferris wheel, its skeletal frame clawing at the sky. A garish, faded clown face, painted on what looked like the entrance to a funhouse, leered at me through the swirling vapor. I stopped dead. My breath caught in my throat. A closed amusement park. Here? How? This was miles from anything, deep in the wilderness. The structure was immense, towering over the fog-shrouded landscape, yet I had never seen it, never heard of it. Its silence was different from the manor's, a heavy, abandoned quiet, filled with the ghosts of forgotten laughter and screams. A faint, high-pitched whine reached my ears, a sound like grinding metal. I looked towards the Ferris wheel. One of its decrepit gondolas, painted a faded yellow, swung gently, slowly, as if nudged by an unseen hand. It seemed to beckon. My legs moved not towards the main road, not away, but towards the rusted gates of the park. My steps were no longer my own. A strange exhilaration coursed through me, an unsettling lightness. The air here within the park's desolate perimeter felt sharper, cleaner, yet still carried that metallic, sweet tang. The clown's painted smile widened, or so it seemed, in the shifting fog. I reached the entrance, the corroded metal sign above it unreadable, its letters eaten away by time and rust. I pushed through the creaking turnstile, which groaned in protest, a sound that seemed to echo through the entire, vast expanse of the closed amusement park. Inside, the paths were cracked and overgrown, strewn with fallen leaves and debris. Rotting concession stands stood like empty husks. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and decay, but beneath it, that other smell, the metallic sweetness, was stronger here. It was the scent of me. I wasn't free. I had not escaped. The house had merely extended itself, or perhaps I had become its vessel. My own thoughts felt distant, observed. My hands, I noticed, were no longer trembling. They were steady, calm, ready. I looked back through the swirling fog towards where the manor should have been. It was gone, swallowed by the mist, by the new reality. Or perhaps it was simply no longer needed. The horror wasn't in the house or even in the abandoned park. It was within me. The silence was the echo of its triumph, and I, Thomas, was its new keeper. And the amusement park, with its empty rides and silent screams, was just the beginning of my new domain. The next chapter.